The Atlantic Ocean, vast and unpredictable, has always been a stage for global drama. But rarely has a single rusted oil tanker captured the world's attention quite like this. As the sun rises over choppy waters, a vessel, once anonymous, now infamous, cuts a lonely path. Its hull battered by years of service, and more recently, by the weight of international intrigue. This is not just a story about oil, or even about a ship. It's about the collision of superpowers, the shadowy world of sanctions, and the lengths nations will go to protect their interests. Why is the world watching this oil ship? Because in its wake, it drags the hopes, fears, and ambitions of three nations: Venezuela, Russia, and the United States. Each determined to shape the future of energy, influence, and power. The story begins not in a boardroom or a war room, but on the open sea, where the rules are as fluid as the tides. The ship, flagged under shifting identities, is more than a vessel. It's a symbol. For Venezuela, it represents economic survival, a lifeline to a world market that has largely turned its back. For Russia, it's a chess piece, a way to project power and frustrate American ambitions. For the United States, it's a test of resolve, a chance to enforce sanctions and send a message to adversaries everywhere. The stakes are high, the players are relentless. But what makes this chase different from the countless others that have played out on the world's oceans? It's the convergence of technology, politics, and desperation. As the ship zigzags through international waters, it's tracked by satellites, shadowed by coast guards, and watched by millions online. Every maneuver is scrutinized, every signal analyzed. The world is watching, not just because of what's at stake, but because, in this moment, the fate of a single ship seems to echo the fate of nations. The origins of this high seas drama stretch back years, rooted in the tangled web of global oil politics and the relentless pressure of economic sanctions. Venezuela, once one of the world's top oil exporters, has seen its fortunes wane under the weight of international embargoes and internal turmoil. The United States, determined to force political change in Caracas, has tightened the screws with a series of sanctions aimed at crippling Venezuela's oil industry, the country's economic lifeblood. These measures, while intended to isolate President Nicolas Maduro's government, have instead driven Venezuela to seek new partners and creative ways to keep its oil flowing to the world. Enter Russia, a nation with its own history of defying Western pressure. For Moscow, supporting Venezuela is about more than just oil. It's about challenging American dominance and expanding its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russian advisors, financiers, and even naval assets have become fixtures in Venezuela's struggle to survive. The partnership is mutually beneficial. Venezuela gets a powerful ally, while Russia gains a foothold in a region long considered America's backyard. The oil ship at the center of this story is a product of this alliance, a vessel that, on paper, may belong to a shell company in the Caribbean, but in reality, is a pawn in a much larger game. As the ship prepared to leave port, its mission was clear: evade U.S. detection, reach Venezuelan waters, and load a precious cargo of crude oil. But nothing about this journey would be simple. American intelligence agencies, well aware of the ship's significance, had been tracking its movements for weeks. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and informants on the ground all pointed to a single conclusion: the ship was about to attempt a high-risk run through waters patrolled by the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the resolve of all involved, and the world's media began to take notice, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding on the high seas as the ship slipped away from its last known port. The tension was palpable. On board, the crew operated under a veil of secrecy, aware that every move could be their last as free men. The captain, a veteran of countless voyages, now faced a challenge unlike any before, outmaneuvering the world's most powerful navy. The ship's transponder, which should have broadcast its location to maritime authorities, was mysteriously silent. Instead, the vessel relied on old-fashioned navigation, hugging shipping lanes just outside the reach of American patrols, while occasionally disappearing from radar altogether. For those watching from afar, the ship's vanishing act only added to the sense of mystery and danger. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., officials at the Treasury and State Departments monitored the situation with growing concern. The U.S. had made it clear that any attempt to circumvent sanctions would be met with swift action. Orders were relayed to the Coast Guard and Navy units stationed in the Caribbean and Atlantic: intercept the vessel, but avoid escalation. The challenge was not just legal, but diplomatic. Any misstep could trigger an international incident, especially if Russian interests were directly involved. The world's media, hungry for details, speculated endlessly about the ship's true destination and the identities of those pulling the strings behind the scenes in Moscow. The mood was defiant. Russian officials dismissed American warnings as imperialist bluster and reaffirmed their commitment to supporting Venezuela. State media portrayed the ship's journey as a heroic act of resistance against Western oppression. For ordinary Russians, the story became a symbol of national pride. A David versus Goliath struggle playing out on the world stage. In Caracas, the Maduro government seized the moment to rally its supporters, framing the ship's mission as a fight for sovereignty and dignity. Across 3 continents, the fate of a single oil tanker had become a litmus test for the balance of power in a rapidly changing world. As the days passed, its journey became a real-time spectacle. Social media lit up with speculation, as amateur sleuths tracking the vessel's last known coordinates, and maritime enthusiasts debating its next move. News outlets from London to Buenos Aires ran breathless updates, each new twist feeding a growing sense of suspense. Would the ship make it to Venezuelan waters, or would it be intercepted in a dramatic showdown? The world watched as the vessel, now dubbed the ghost ship by some, seemed to slip through the fingers of its pursuers time and again. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy intensified their efforts. Surveillance aircraft circled overhead, relaying images back to command centers. Fast attack boats shadowed the tanker at a cautious distance, careful not to provoke a confrontation, but ready to act if given the order. The legal complexities were daunting. International maritime law is a labyrinth of treaties and conventions, and the ship's shifting registry at times flying the flag of a Caribbean nation, at others displaying hastily painted Russian colors, made it difficult to establish clear jurisdiction. Every decision carried risks, not just for the crew and the ship, but for the fragile balance of power between nations. In Venezuela, anticipation reached a fever pitch. State television broadcast live updates, framing the ship's progress as a national victory. Crowds gathered in port cities, waving flags and chanting slogans in support of the crew. For many Venezuelans, the ship represented more than just oil. It was a symbol of defiance in the face of hardship, a rare moment of hope in a country battered by years of crisis. In Russia, too, the story resonated. Commentators drew parallels to Cold War standoffs, casting the ship's journey as a modern-day test of wills. The world's attention, once fleeting, now seemed fixed on the fate of a single, battered tanker in the geopolitical storm. Swirling around it, the drama reached new heights when reports emerged that the ship's crew had painted a Russian flag on the hull, a bold move designed to complicate any attempt at seizure. The image, captured by surveillance drones and quickly circulated online, sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. For the United States, the gesture was a provocation, a clear signal that any action against the vessel could be interpreted as an affront to Moscow itself. For Russia, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, forcing Washington to weigh the risks of escalation against the optics of backing down. The world's media seized on the development, with headlines blaring about a potential flashpoint between nuclear-armed rivals. Inside the White House, advisors debated the next steps. Some urged caution, warning that a direct confrontation could spiral out of control. Others argued that failing to act would embolden America's adversaries and undermine the credibility of U.S. sanctions. The president, aware of the stakes, demanded options. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard maintained its pursuit, trailing the tanker at a respectful distance, engines idling as orders from above were awaited. The tension was almost cinematic, a slow-motion standoff playing out on the open sea, with the world as its audience. In Caracas, the Maduro government celebrated the ship's audacity. State media broadcast triumphant footage of the Russian flag, framing it as proof of international solidarity against American imperialism. The narrative was clear. Venezuela, with Russia's backing, had outmaneuvered the world's most powerful nation. For ordinary Venezuelans, the story offered a rare sense of pride and unity, a reminder that their country still mattered on the global stage. In Moscow, officials issued statements of support, warning the U.S. against any reckless actions. The ship, once a mere vessel, had become a symbol, a floating battleground in a larger struggle for influence, resources, and respect. The world watched, transfixed. As the standoff entered its most dangerous phase yet, as the world held its breath, the ship's fate hung in the balance. Every hour brought new rumors. Had the U.S. finally received the green light to board? Or would the vessel slip away under the cover of darkness? In the corridors of power from Washington to Moscow, phones rang and tempers flared. Diplomats scrambled to defuse the crisis. Military commanders weighed the risks of a miscalculation that could ignite a wider conflict. The Atlantic, usually a highway for commerce and travel, had become a chessboard where every move was fraught with peril. For the crew, the tension was almost unbearable. Each day at sea was a gamble, each radio transmission a potential warning of imminent danger. Yet amid the anxiety, there was also a sense of purpose. They were not just transporting oil. They were carrying the hopes of a nation, the ambitions of an ally, and the defiance of a people who refused to be cowed by distant powers. The ship's battered hull, scarred by years of service, now bore the weight of history itself in the end. The world's attention was not just on a ship, but on what it represented: the enduring struggle for sovereignty, the limits of power, and the unpredictable consequences of global rivalry. The story of this oil tanker was never just about fuel or money. It was about the stories nations tell themselves, the lines they draw in the sand, and the lengths they will go to defend their interests. As the sun set over the Atlantic, the ship pressed on, its destination uncertain, its legacy already assured. And so, as the world watched, one question remained. In an age of shifting alliances and rising tensions, who truly controls the seas? The answer, for now, is as elusive as the ship itself, lost somewhere between the horizon and the headlines. A mystery that will haunt the corridors of power long after the waves have washed away its wake.